No mystery behind the Prime Minister's collapsing polls as more and more voters regard him as out of touch and weak. Because he is out of touch and he is weak. A strong and decisive leader would never have allowed this country to suffer through increasing waves of anti-Semitism, culminating in a domestic terror incident in the early hours of Friday morning as a Melbourne synagogue was firebombed with people inside, CCTV showing masked men spreading accelerant around the building and then setting it alight. And a leader in touch with the national mood would not have waited until almost 4 days later to deal with it publicly, as he finally did today, fronting a press conference with ministers and officials that really should have been held on Friday morning as the events at the synagogue became clearer. Now, I'm also dumbfounded as to why he waited until today to convene his National Security Committee, the body with all the intelligence agencies and experts around the table. Why has it taken the Prime Minister so long to get the NSC together? When the Lindt siege happened in Sydney, then Prime Minister Tony Abbott, well, he convened the NSC within hours. And the NSC continued to meet day and throughout the night as the siege was finally brought to an end at around 2:30 in the morning. And yet under this Prime Minister, there's no time for a weekend security meeting, but he can find time for a game of tennis, something he was asked about today by the media.
Given the visit to Perth, was it a misjudgment to be playing tennis on the Saturday morning when the community...
Well, I wasn't playing tennis on the Saturday morning.
At the Cottesloe Tennis
I
Club?
wasn't playing tennis on the Saturday morning.
That's wrong?
Yeah, that is wrong.
There's a view on Facebook.
I had 6 appointments on Saturday. After they had concluded late in the afternoon, I did some exercise. That's what people do.
Sorry. If you've got time to play tennis in the afternoon, you've got time to get back on your plane, you've got a RAF jet, get back on your plane and get across to the eastern side of the country. As I wrote in my newspaper column yesterday, imagine if a mosque was firebombed during Friday prayers. Do you really think the government's response could have waited until Monday? Would Tony Abbott or John Howard have gone off to play tennis rather than taking their plane back to Melbourne and meeting with officials and the Jewish community, Victorian police? I think we all know the answer to that, don't we? For almost 4 days, the weak and diminished man running our country couldn't bring himself to call this synagogue bombing a terror attack, claiming that that's the job for the police commissioner. Now, I'll give you the memo. Real leaders don't refuse to state the bleeding obvious or claim that it's someone else's job to do it. Real leaders lead. It's no wonder that Anthony Albanese's news poll rating for being strong and decisive has fallen 5 points to 44% compared to Peter Dutton on 60%. Now, this is the lowest score for a Prime Minister since 2008, when news poll first began to measure strong and decisive. Weak and morally confused is about the only way to describe our Prime Minister's leadership since the October 7 atrocity last year. Indeed, his whole government's been twisting itself into knots to appease a unity ticket of extreme leftists who see Israel as some outpost of settler colonialism and Islamists who want to drive all Jews into the sea. Just this morning, Chris Bowen got himself into all sorts of trouble trying to insist that Islamophobia is no less a problem than anti-Semitism, even though it's only synagogues that have been firebombed and Jewish areas vandalised.
He said that that Islamophobia shouldn't be mentioned in the same sentence as the Prime Minister has done. If James Patterson thinks there's no Islamophobia in Australia, he's wrong.
He didn't say that, though. He said that when something happens, it should be enough to just denounce anti-Semitism.
He went on to say that they're not at the same levels. Look, but the point of the matter is...
Hang on a minute, are you saying they are at the same levels? Because we've just seen a targeted attack on a synagogue.
I'm saying, Patricia, that both exist, and I'm saying that both can be called out.
You are a clown, Bowen. I also want to draw your attention to this outrageous slur from Labor Grub Minister Murray Watt, claiming Josh Frydenberg's criticism about the government's woeful response to anti-Semitism was somehow Frydenberg playing politics, not the response of a concerned Jewish Australian.
I respect the fact that Mr Frydenberg is of the Jewish faith and he has very strong feelings about this, but I don't think we can separate the fact that he has a very long career as a Liberal Party politician and that is no doubt one of the reasons he's made these comments.
Geez, Bob Hawke didn't like anti-Semitism. He's not playing politics then, was he? I mean, that's a low blow for even Murray Watt. Over the weekend, the Jewish Labor MP, Josh Burns, well, he was booed at a Jewish vigil in Melbourne. He then went on to apologise for his party's handling of the anti-Semitism crisis. He said, and I quote, "There's more to be done." Well, you can say that again. But what can never be undone is the government's supine response on this issue thus far. From October 7 last year onwards, the Prime Minister's consistently failed to call out anti-Semitism without linking it in the same breath to the all but non-existent Islamophobia. Within scarcely a fortnight of the Hamas atrocity, Senior Minister Tony Burke, who's got 25% of his electorate as Muslim voters, well, he said that Hamas terrorism has to be seen in its historical context. Now, he was cheered for those comments at a Queensland festival, saying that the history of the Middle East, and I quote, did not begin on the 7th of October. In all of the Prime Minister's travels, and he loves to go overseas, unlike the leaders of other countries like the US, the UK, France and more, well, he's never found time to stop even for a couple of hours in Israel. And when his Foreign Minister Penny Wong visited there earlier this year, she refused to visit any of the massacre sites. It took our Prime Minister, let's not forget, nearly a fortnight to call his Israeli counterpart after the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust. Yet he was on the blower, wasn't he? Within 24 hours after an Australian had been killed in an Israeli airstrike that went horribly wrong, even ordering an inquiry into it, not into the Hamas misdeeds, but into how Israel had handled a terrible accident. After 14 months of hate speech, illegal encampments, frequent large, aggressive and disruptive protests, not a single hate preacher has been charged or deported, and not a single disruption has been banned or dispersed. It's as if the Labor Party, in power almost everywhere across the country, sees calling for the extermination of Jews from the river to the sea as just a bit of over-the-top rhetoric rather than the advocating of genocide, which it surely is. And for any leader of this country to all but excuse terrorism-inducing hatred, which is what anti-Semitism is, as something that's been around a long time, as the Prime Minister did on Friday, well, this is gutless and repugnant, not to Australian Jews alone, but to all of us, to every Australian, regardless of our faith. The only way to describe Labor's moral compass on this issue is deranged. Imagine the reaction if the Gas the Jews, the F the Jews protesters back on October 9 at the Opera House had been equally vociferous about gay people or people with a disability or, God forbid, Indigenous Australians. There would instantly have been multiple arrests. But letting it run, as he did, allowed the store to fester. The sore has festered. And Friday is what happens when hate is all but sanctioned by the state. Because it's not just weakness that our Prime Minister's displayed, it's double standards too. And Australians know it. I believe it's why he's got one almighty reckoning coming his way when eventually he does call that election.